Every once in a while, there's one of those games you just kind of see on social media, like Twitter or something, and you know that it's a game that will be interesting, but you kind of forget about it. And that was Gord for me. Well, until the Steam Next Fest a couple months ago, and ever since then, playing the first 2 missions of Gord, I've been hooked. I couldn't stop thinking about when the game would release, if I would be able to have access to it, and when I'd be able to play it. Unfortunately, my life has been really busy right now. I've had a lot of family stuff going on, but I've finally gotten around to playing Gord, and after 20 plus hours, I think I'm finally ready for a review. Now, as I've said, I've been very hyped for Gord, meaning that I have a lot of expectations, especially off of the really great showing of those first 2 missions. And it pains me to say that unfortunately, I don't think Gord completely lived up to the hype, but it's not as simple as saying, hey, it's bad, because that's not the case at all. And actually, it's quite promising for the future if I really think of it that way. So with that being said, I'm going to break this down into my usual core 4 categories for my reviews. We've got the story, the gameplay, the visuals, and then of course, the audio with the sound design. And for your need-to-knows, Gord is a single-player adventure strategy game that's really heavily emphasized on its base building. There's also some smaller aspects of the RTS genre that are there too, but we'll get to that. And this is coming from Covenant Dev, a developer that's made up a lot of the previous teams that have worked for, say, The Witcher. And this is a Polish studio, so you kind of see the lineage there as it is. And for the publisher, this is actually coming from Team 17, so somebody I think that a lot of people will know that name of, if nothing else. And like I said, I put in just over 20 hours for the game. That's 10 missions. I haven't messed around with any of the extra stuff, the, custom scenarios, anything like that. That's going to really give the game life. But with these 10 missions alone, I'm looking at the price of $34.99 US dollars and about 20 hours. And I'm thinking to myself, I think that's a really good price proposition for what this is. So off the bat, I'm thinking not that bad. But let's go ahead and jump into the story, and I do have a lot of thoughts here. So in Gord, you are the King's Steward. You're tasked with leading a local tribe towards a stockpile of gold needed for the greater war efforts. But of course, things go awry and they take a turn for, you could say, the worse. But starting right away with the story, I'd like to throw out the idea that this game feels like the perfect Alien. A really, really interesting and thoughtful world that I'd love to see a more developed and fleshed out sequel for. There's so much lore here that a good bit of the gods' names and in-universe words are becoming less foreign to me now after all the time that I've played. Not to mention the setting is one where the sun has pretty much completely gone, so you find yourself needing to have light sources all around at all times in order to preserve the sanity of all those you look over. Then there's giant snakes and spiders, enemy tribesmen, bears, and even mimic creatures, and they all do a great job of making the world feel grounded and crunchy, but still fantastical enough for what the setting needs. Truthfully though, in tone, this is the closest thing I've ever seen to a wildling simulator for Game of Thrones. And with all of that going for it for its premise alone, I really think it's unfortunate that the story itself, to me, didn't deliver. Though I like the first bit of narrative presentation with the cinematic and story setup, I ultimately felt the story takes too long to go anywhere because it really feels like the story needed to be a tutorial for the first 3 to 4 levels, which in a 10 mission campaign, that's really not that much to work with. Ultimately, I felt like that was very good for the gameplay pacing because there's a lot to learn with this game, but it was absolutely brutal for any true interest I had in the story. Each level begins with a new story cutscene, and occasionally there are some throughout the levels. Usually these feature a small cast of characters who talk to the camera as if I were really there. I don't really think I like this because it always feels like the game is being too direct with what it's telling me to do. And that's exactly what these cutscenes are. Thinly veiled objectives with very little narrative fluff, and once it really does begin to beef up story-wise in these cutscenes, it's really just too late for me to care about any of these characters. And that's sad because I think there is potential there. And also for like the last third of the game, it seems like the characters don't even really talk to you anymore, so if you're looking at it from the idea that you're like still in first person in these cutscenes with them, they're not talking to you anymore, so they're like basically completely ignoring you at this point, and it just somehow manages to feel even more bizarre. Now, one aspect that I think can be redeeming for some, and this was what I really liked about the demo of the game, is the personal connections with the citizens. As your world grows, so does the population. Be that rescuing someone in the woods, a newcomer in between levels, or, well, baby making, there's always a neat story and biography attached to each character. Even more so, you're allowed to rename these characters so that you may better connect and keep track of who and what they are. Not to mention that each character has their own unique traits and stats and even feelings towards your decisions. For instance, if I give away a child to a demon, that parent's sanity is going to take a pretty big dive, This open-ended nature of storytelling with the villagers is amazing when you can really focus in on it. So I'll talk more about the gameplay soon, but I really can't overstate how amazing it is in the second mission to have a character whose bio stated that they had just lost their 2 kids. Then for them to have another kid under your rule, who I then promptly sacrificed to a horror demon in the swamp for safe passage. Don't get me wrong, that was the evil choice, but quite frankly, it was either sacrifice a child or fight the demon who I had no hopes of winning against. I was just doing the right thing here, for the king, you know what I mean? At the end of the day, it wasn't some grand narrative that interested me, but rather where it was happening. The setting of Gord is a slam dunk, but if there ever was a sequel, I would definitely need a more compelling narrative to truly drive the story forward. Moving on to the gameplay, I need to express my frustration fully. In order to do so, let's talk a little bit about how the minute-to-minute of the game works, and legitimately, I believe it mostly still works. As I've already said, there's 10 levels to the campaign. Most of these follow the basic loop of picking your starting crew, starting a base, and then over time upgrading buildings and balancing resources in order to stay at optimal condition to complete whatever mission objective there is. I, for the most part, enjoy these missions and objectives. There's RTS and RPG staples here, side quests in the world, provide benefits for your efforts, and the types of main objectives vary from survive for X amount of time, or go here and kill this, or even a mission without building a base altogether, kind of like those old StarCraft or Warcraft missions, and I really love those. One thing that I would put on the wishlist for a sequel would be enemy bases. There is usually some form of enemy tribes attacking us throughout the gameplay, but no base for them really to come from. I'd really love to see that and show tangibly in the world who and where they could be coming from. I think that'd be really interesting for a gameplay mechanic in the sequel as well. But what really sets Gord apart from the other RTS games that I grew up on is, well, basically all of it, but mainly the inability to create new units at will. This forces the player to intimately rely on each and every member of your Gord, assigning them to specific tasks to get everything done as efficiently as possible. Now, where this gets really cool is you can equip items that alter their stats in pretty big ways as well. For instance, one of the legendary items you can equip is something that makes it to where any soldiers no longer require gold for their salary, which is huge for the soldiers and their sanity. And of course, you can influence harvesting rates for certain materials, and even the sanity of other characters. This, compounding with each character having their own dislikes and likes, works so well in making it feel like an RPG, where you can control not just the party, but the whole freaking town. I wish you could go 1 or 2 steps further with the characters. Say, for instance, someone could request aid for their own side quest. Say Johnny needs help killing spiders, so you send him out with a crew to kill some. And while side quests are in the game, there isn't that feeling of full-blown randomness that the rest of the game tends to have when it comes to your encounters. And while I like the pseudo-RPG of the game, there are aspects of the gameplay that I just didn't like. First up, on normal difficulty, the game is definitely really challenging at times, though sometimes it's because the game trips over itself with an indiscernible minimap, or some guy whose job it is to collect clay decided to run all the way across the map and get himself killed along the way by a group of spiders. Now, part of that is my human error, but the game really makes it easy for this to happen. The game isn't exactly player-friendly in ways like that. Another smaller issue I had is sometimes when quickly trying to select units with this selection cursor, it wouldn't tag everyone because, I don't know, the hitboxes I guess were smaller or kind of weird. Either way, once again, ultimately it didn't matter because you can pause the game at will, which I really love, but it's still just, it was bizarre and off-putting when it kind of messed with my flow in that sort of thing. Now, outside of the generally tough nature of the game, it pains me to say that I had a fairly poor technical experience as well. Performance was great with no dips in frames at max settings, but there were bugs galore. Anything ranging from NPCs stuck in buildings, the ground, or even pawns, all the way to the camera taking its own initiative and moving on its own. And then you can go even further with major game-breaking bugs, like quest objectives not advancing forward to the next stage, or even missing parts of gameplay for a quest altogether. I was so disappointed with the presentation of Gord on a technical level. And the only reason I really wanted to bring this up for the gameplay section is because this game is very slow and methodical. So imagine you're, I don't know, say 40 minutes into a level, and then the quest objectives won't continue, making it a fail state. You have to restart the level because that level version is corrupted. And to me, that's not something I can recommend easily. I'm sure there will be fixes for this at some point, but I would definitely pay attention to that before considering getting the game, because if I would have known that going in, I definitely would have waited. Not to mention, this messes up the pacing of the gameplay as well, making certain levels feel too long and drawn out, And quite frankly, at one point, I dropped the difficulty down just to get through a level that I'd almost completed. In an ideal world, a sequel could round out the rough edges both technically speaking and from a gameplay standpoint, refining an already good base system and adding more to make it an even more compelling experience. And outside of bugs, I don't really fault the game for what it isn't, say the enemy bases, which that was never the idea or anything like that, but it does make it sting all the more that there is a promising game here when something goes wrong. Now, next up for the third category, I want to talk about the visuals, and here is where I think the game is at its most charming. From different resources to a decent amount of enemy variety, and loads of unique terrains and textures, Gord is a good looking game. At least when you have the camera zoomed out. Up close, it's, there's textures are a little more rough. Definitely, if we're talking about The Witcher, reminds me closer to The Witcher 2 rather than The Witcher 3, but that's just how it goes. But all of the things I mentioned provide a great palette of color for what you'd expect in a dark fantasy world. As you roam over all the landscapes, you'll see just enough lush greens and dark reds as you'd expect from an eclipsed world. And as the main aspect of the game is light sources, I was really happy to see how much detail was put into the particles for the fires and the fireflies, and the high detailed shadows that were cast by your lights. My only real complaints visually speaking came down to the characters and the minimap. Characters specifically, as I said, you zoom in, they look kind of rough in the gameplay, but once I said zoomed out and everything's in motion, this game looks really good. And I really do mean that. The other thing with the characters though is, quite frankly, all of the characters looked kind of samey. They looked very similar. Of course, my exception to this, and you'll see it throughout this video, are the cutscenes of the game. And that's where most of the actual story characters are, and that's when the game is the best, but don't get me wrong, it's still not amazing there either. Like I said, there's those weird little issues where they're looking at the camera, but then they're not talking to you. Eventually, by the end of the game, it's really weird. But ultimately, those cutscenes were a cut above, in a sense. But even then, I'd love to see those refined in a potential sequel. Flashing back around to the minimap, I'll tell you why exactly I hate it. To their credit, you can turn aspects of the legend on and off, say the resources, the enemies, and it really clears up the minimap to some degree. Unfortunately, I think the only color that really shows out well on the minimap is the red for the enemies. I just don't like the color choices they used of the dark greens and all these different colors that just don't show up really well on a minimap at all. You can zoom it in and get a little bit of a better view, but when you're moving all around the actual game map as itself, it's hard to want to stay minimized in the minimap for any sense of time. Basically, all I'm really trying to say is the way the map looks, it's really hard to really discern useful information on a granular level that this game really requires. My praise for the visuals doesn't end there though. The attention to detail in the handcrafted environments is immaculate. As you find bandit camps, monster lairs, and even the dens of horrors, you'll notice that how the world is perceived around you is quite different. It's all so well handled, and my favorite small detail is when people are walking around your base and going from place to place, you'll notice trails start to form in between buildings as they frequent them. To me, the small issues I have visually do very little to detract from the consistent and wonderful looking world created by Covenant Dev here. The attention to detail is near perfect in any less detailed textures, and any of the less detailed textures are complemented well by the drawn back nature of the camera and the fog of war that's created with the very, very dark looking world that surrounds our characters. Now, another great aspect of Gord is actually the sound design. This is one aspect of the game that I'm pretty much in high praise of all the way around. As soon as you're in the menu, you're going to be hit with music that's very reminiscent, I would say, of The Witcher 3, with the very vocal soundtrack. Longer drawn and pluckier instrumentals play throughout different levels, and it all sounds really good there too. And ultimately, I don't think the music ever feels off tune with how the game makes you feel downtrodden and always fighting for survival. But music isn't the only aspect of sound design. There's also, of course, the voice acting. In the cutscenes, you've got 3 or 4 main characters that are speaking, and all of those sound really, really good. I actually mean that. There's very few lines that are delivered in a little bit of a weird way by one of the characters that I won't get into for spoiler's sake. But overall, I never felt like the voices were what was taking me out of these cutscenes, and for that, I think that's pretty high praise here. It's also important to note that the village elder is also your, stereotypical RTS character that's telling you what's happening around the base to kind of keep you informed, our brother is under attack or something like that. And he always says our brother. It's so cool. It very much makes me feel at home here, you know what I mean? And I think the game really does a good job of keeping you well informed in aspects like that. I think that's great. Continuing with the sound cues though, there's also like the war horns that play whenever there's combat or any kind of negative effects happening to your villagers. And I think that's great because it's just, guttural enough to think, okay, what's going wrong? Where do I have to look? And that's when I have to, take out my reading glasses and look at the minimap and see just what exactly is wrong. Hell, I think even little flashing on the minimap, just like Warcraft 3, would do wonders. But it's to not waste your time on anything more about the sound because I don't know the minute details about, oh, the mixing is this or that. It all sounded really good in headphones, and I think that works really well for the experience that you're going to have here in a single-player game. But to round out, I wanted to kind of do a final verdict. Gord is a game on a story level was hit or miss for me. The main story and the motivations started out strong with a premise, but quickly devolved into a kind of forgettable and predictable story. But what really saves it for me is the create your own story of your villagers and the random nature of the decisions thrown at you in the RPG gameplay. Speaking of gameplay, however, I think the RTS aspects of this game are good. Each level has a different style of RTS objective, all building on the baselines of what you've previously learned. Whether that's managing your resources like sanity for your villagers, wood for building, or even gold for paying your soldiers, there's so much. Unfortunately for me, what really drags me down, in my opinion, for this game is the bugs. This game is one of the worst games I've played in recent years for bugs. And quite frankly, that's just not cool. That's not something you want to waste your time on because that's what it is. Thankfully though, one thing that makes it a little bit easier of a recommendation is the visuals and the sound design. To me, the visuals, outside of the minimap and some samey looking characters, is all really good, especially in motion. Continuing that on, the music and the sound cues and even the voice acting all come together in such a way that it never takes you out of the action and definitely never takes you out of that mind space to be in Gord. So with that being said, at around 20 hours of playtime, maybe if you don't have to restart missions it'll be less, and $34.99 US, I can't recommend this game at this time. I definitely would recommend waiting until about $20 or at least some, bugs are fixed. I know they've talked about that on their dev pages, but that's really all I think about Gord. I think I was really excited for it, and I think the game let me down in a major way. And ultimately, it wasn't even because of story stuff. It was definitely because of the bugs. And, if you've played the game, let me know what you think, and let me know what you think about the rest of the critique, because I definitely really enjoyed parts of this game, and I want to see that sequel. And if you're from Covenant Team, for whatever reason, and you're listening to this ramble, hello? I like your game. I want to love your game. I'm sorry for the rambling, but, I'll see you on the next one. Hello, Stan.